Good morning to you all. And for me personally, I realized as I was coming here this morning that it's probably about the 10th anniversary since my first involvement with a World Education Summit. That was in Delhi. But I've been away a few years. And so this is actually the first time back, I think, in around 6 years. So it's wonderful to be with you again, and great to see, I think, the way that this forum has moved forward, the energy levels that have been carried forward by the organizers, and I commend them for that. And I think that's evidenced by the panels of speakers that they've been able to pull together for all of the sessions over both days. So I think that's very heartening and very encouraging. And this morning's session, when we're talking about innovation, is of course at the very heart of what the whole conference is about. And I think it's a fascinating time in the history of humanity to be talking about innovation. The previous speaker, I think, very poignantly touched upon the issue that India is such a vast and complex country and such a complex society that whilst we can all be here talking about Industry 4.0, we also have to acknowledge that in different places and in different ways in this country, there is 4.0, 3.0, 2.0, 1.0, and even the agricultural revolution all happening at the same time. It's all going on at the same time, and it all impacts different groups of people in different ways, and every one of those groups of people deserves and needs to be thought about in terms of how it's going to meet their needs and how their needs are going to be met. There was once a description given that when you're involved extensively in any field that involves massive change, it's like flying the airplane at 35,000 feet and rebuilding it while you're flying. It's not easy. In fact, a lot of the time, it's downright scary. But what a ride. If you're ready to be on the plane, then it is one fantastic ride and one fantastic opportunity. But the obligations are enormous for all of us who choose to make education our field. Every change that's ever happened in history has had its resistors. It's had its people who feared. And fear is perhaps one of the biggest factors that holds back innovation. It's one of the reasons why in the English language we actually have a noun that comes from a person's name, and that noun, that word is Luddite. For those who are not familiar with the word Luddite, the Luddites have their origin in a secret organization at the time of the Industrial Revolution, led by a man named Ned Ludd, and their particular area of fear was in the textile industry in Britain, where the textile industry was changing so massively, and the fear was there'd be no jobs for anybody tomorrow. And that's, when you take it to the human level, suddenly somebody is faced with a possibility. Will I be able to put food in the mouths of my children tomorrow? And so when these very human fears come along, those at the forefront of technology have to acknowledge those fears and be able to work with them and work with the people to ensure that they're part of the positive journey and not part of the resistance that has to be dragged along behind as the change happens. Because any change journey as well involves way more elements than just the technology we might be here talking about today. When one of my colleagues was talking earlier about technology, I was reminded, of course, of if you think about something simple like the motor car. It was Henry Ford who famously said, if I went out and asked the people what they wanted, they'd have said they simply wanted a faster horse. So those who worked in this area of innovation and all of that issue of where do we go and how do we change the world, were taking the world to places that didn't always feel comfortable. And we are going to face daily news stories of the issues of how the change and the innovation comes up against conflict. This weekend, there are all the fears of massive protests in Paris. 65,000 police personnel being mobilized to try to minimize the impacts of those. We have the stories this week of doctors in China who appear to have been apparently doing work that no one else in China even knew they were doing, which involved the genetic modification of human babies before birth. One of the realities of technology change is that it has moral issues, it has value issues, it has principles issues, and we have to be ready to deal with all of those. The motor car brought all sorts of issues of change, not just in terms of the manufacture. One of the areas it massively changed was the way people worked. What was expected of labor? What happened to the dignity of labor? Suddenly, there was minute specialization, Taylorism, the belief that if we can just get each person to handle one more widget per hour, then we can get X% increase and improvement in productivity. So suddenly, the way we saw people in the society changed. The way society was stratified changed. The world changed for the pedestrian. There was massive fear at the time of the motor car that the world would no longer be safe for people who walked. As a result, many of the early cars had to have somebody walk along in front of them with a flag to tell them that the car was coming. I'd like to see them try that on many of the highways in India now. I wouldn't want to be the man with the flag. It changed everything about tourism and travel. It changed everything about how we use our leisure. It changed all sorts of aspects about the family. And when we start to translate these to where we are today with learning, the learning process itself, for us as much as for our children and for our young people, it's an always-on world. It's now reckoned that there is more new knowledge published every year now than used to come along in 20 or 30 years. None of us humanly are going to keep up with that volume of knowledge, but of course we have to change our paradigm and say we don't have to. It's not actually necessary. Because now, when knowledge is ubiquitous, knowledge doesn't matter very much. Now, when you stand in front of a room full of teachers and say knowledge doesn't matter very much anymore, you better have a tin helmet. Because that's a nasty thing for teachers to hear when their past was built on the fact that they were the supreme carriers of bodies of knowledge, whose job was to go out and share that knowledge and pass it on to other people. So suddenly we're changing the very nature of what a teacher does and how they do it. We're changing the very nature of what a teacher is. I can give one little example. We've recently been doing some research and some experimentation in Malaysia, where we said, look, we've got a problem because we were running A-level programs in three different campuses. And it was expensive. And not only was it expensive, but we also ran up against all sorts of quality constraints. One of them was physics teachers are so very hard to find, and I've got 3 separate principals who each want to find a top quality physics teacher. They can't find them. Because especially in this high technology industry 4.0 world, the alternatives for physics teachers and people who are skilled and trained in those areas are so abundant and so much better paying than being teachers. So what are you going to do? Well, the first thing, and this is where you really get into what actually is innovation and how does it work. Innovation is that you've got to open up to just throwing away the rule book about how you may have done things in the past. Because now you start to say, if we took the physics syllabus, the physics curriculum, and we disintermediate it, we rip it apart, and we separate it into different parts. One part being that part which is best delivered in lectures. And then find one superb physics teacher who is a brilliant lecturer to deliver those lectures, maybe even just one time. video record them. Now I don't need the 3. Now what do I need in each place? I need tutors. I need people who coach students in their own learning. I need people who are working directly with the students to support their own learning on the ground, who are taking their lead, perhaps from the super physics teacher who's covering all 3 schools. Not only is it enormously valuable as an improvement and an enhancement for the learner, but it's probably also going to help my bottom line when it comes to the financials of running the institute, because now I'm not trying to find 3 top-level super physics teachers. So that's just one small example I would give where you've got to actually go through that process of tearing down before you can build up. The need is massive. Moore's law and the growth of computing power means we're not just talking about something that might be interesting on the horizon. We're talking about things that are mind-boggling. If you just take, for example, the simple little example that happened with the game Go. You had a computer that they developed, a powerful supercomputer, that after some tweaking was able to beat the world champion at Go. Why? Because human beings had programmed it with all sorts of information about past games of Go and the rules of how Go worked and all those things. Within months only, there was a new supercomputer that taught itself Go and beat the previous computer 100 games to nil after, I think it was little more than 9 or 10 months. A computer that taught itself. A computer that made what by human considerations we think of as judgments about what was worthwhile knowledge and what wasn't worthwhile knowledge. What was knowledge that took it to a closer level to mastery and what wasn't. Now the implications of all of that, even for our own brains and our own minds. If tomorrow AI could enable you to be Einstein, would you choose to be average? I don't think I would. But have I fully today got my head around the possibilities and the implications of what that means? It means, for example, that I would live in a world where part of my mind, for want of a better term, is inside and part is outside. Arguably, we already have that. My smartphone is on the table there. I can remember a time in my life when if you'd asked me what my mother's phone number was, I could tell you. I couldn't tell you today because I trust that it's in the memory of the phone. The phone has become an extension of my own memory already. We are bringing up young people for the future, not for the world we grew up in. And the education we deliver has to, in every respect, challenge all the paradigms that linked to the past and instead look at what does the young person need to excel in that world of the future. And in the context of India, as one or two of the speakers have already quite rightly said, that means that you've at the same time got to address those whose world is going to change because agriculture in this country will no longer be that massively labor-intensive, massively low-tech field that it has been in the past, and that it could continue to be in the past because it didn't need to modernize, because its cost bases were so low, etc., etc., etc. When those people's lives change, how will those people need support for the future? How will you ensure that the demographic dividend doesn't become the demographic liability? Especially in a world which, regrettably and unfortunately, is going to go through periods where the xenophobia that flows out of fear of these changes will lead to people putting up shutters and closing down. It becomes even more important, and the next session that we're going to be having today here in this room is about local and global thinking. And that becomes a vital part, along with the technology issues, of us opening our minds up to what's needed and what's essential. we need to be innovating. We need to be innovating our schools and our educational institutions at every level, in processes, in the fundamental questions we ask about what learning is needed and what learning is no longer needed, in the way we deliver, in the way we treat our employees and our staff. Innovation doesn't all flow from the top. Innovation doesn't flow because you employ some super thinker to be the leader. It doesn't flow because you are the omnipotent owner of the institution who happens to have a wad of cash in their pocket. That doesn't make you innovator-in-chief to the exclusion of all others. Innovation has to come from every level within every organization. And if there's one thing that worries me whenever I'm here in India about that issue of innovation coming at every level, is the frequency with which I hear educational leaders and, for example, school owners talk about, Mark, you have to remember, theory X and theory Y. They out there in those other countries may be theory X, but we're theory Y. Our people only work when they're made to, which is why we put CCTV cameras in teachers' classrooms, why we do so many things that actually tell our teachers that they are not trusted, that they are a workforce to be controlled, manipulated, directed. How then can we turn around and say, oh, and by the way, please be innovative. Give us innovation. Play a part in innovation. Play a part in the creativity that is about shaping this new future for education. We have to have an education environment that trusts educators, that trains them and prepares them so that they can be trusted partners in the innovation process. Otherwise, the brakes will always be on, and we're going to be very restrained in our progress as innovators. So thank you, and look forward to interacting with many of you later. Thank you.